Hi, everyone. I'm Marina Kukla. I'm going to describe today session 1 from Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Work Success, or CBTW. I'm going to go through some of the things to think about when facilitating CBTW in a group format, especially a virtual group format in this first session, and some things you might keep in mind. I've shared the manual here, the PDF version that you can see. And really the first session is getting people in group, getting people connected with the virtual format and feeling comfortable being there, and having folks introduce themselves and kind of go through why they're there, maybe what some of their goals are for being there and for work, and we'll go through this in a second. These sort of go hand in hand, but can also be different. And then we have some important narratives. So a narrative is when a person tells a story about themselves or their life. And we have several narratives weaved throughout this 12-week intervention. And I think the ones in session 1 are some of our most important. Here we allow veterans or participants to tell their work story, which is kind of like a life story, but specific to work or employment, and might span all the way back to your first job, and then the military, and then perhaps what you've done since then or what you might think about doing. We also ask people to think about their goals and values related to work. And we sort of finished with this, and it acts as a jumping off point for future sessions of this intervention, so people can really think about why it is that they want to work, why it is important to pursue employment, as we think about all of these other things and how our thoughts and feelings and behaviors all interact to play a role as we try to figure out what to pursue and how to go about pursuing those employment goals. So again, session 1 is the group introduction I have here. And so it just talks about this group is for people with work goals. For this particular WORKWELL study, we're only including folks who are currently unemployed, but in previous pilot studies of this, we also had people who were employed, but maybe at risk of losing their job or having that sort of negative outcome. So we did take some of those out of this version of the manual. So now it just says if you have a work goal, you're not working, you might want to work, but your motivation's low, or you find that you're sort of kind of ambivalent about whether you want to work. We have a lot of folks like that. I think that's very appropriate for this intervention. And this is something that has a real chance to help those people. Or that you're a person who's identified a need. Maybe it's a financial need or deficit, and you know that you need money or a place to live and to kind of get things together, but you're not sure how to go about doing that, and maybe work is one option there. Then we sort of introduce people to what this is and sort of what they can expect, and what the CBT model is. Some people have been in CBT before and some never have. I would say for both of those groups, this is a very different CBT model. It's specific and tailored for competitive work, and it really incorporates heavily that narrative component, which is sort of novel and many CBT interventions don't have. It's really focused on letting people explore and tell their own stories and explore how this material is applicable to themselves in their lives. So, which is different, I think, than some CBT that is more stringent or rigid in the way it's presented. Then you go through how this group might help, why they should take their time to come to group each week. So sort of like, why should you be here? What can this help you with? And there are 9 things here, but there could be many other things as well that as facilitators, you've sort of identified or noted or noticed that people sort of grow and benefit as you've been facilitating groups in the past. Then we go to the group goals and we ask people to actually sit with their manuals if they have them. If they don't have them, just sit, maybe pull out a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil and actually write in these spaces what their goals are. Even if they just jot down a quick sentence or a quick note, that's perfectly fine. this doesn't have to be an extensive list, but maybe just a couple of thoughts about for each individual what their goals are. Then you would allow people time to sort of share. You would sort of open up the floor and see if people want to share what those goals are. I think oftentimes most people do go around and say something, but some people may choose not to do that, and they want to keep that to themselves, which is fine. We also ask them to write then about what their goals for work are. This is going to be something that we check in on every week when we do our work check-in at the very beginning of session. And usually that check-in relates somehow to the work goal or what it is they're trying to do or pursue. And that could be anything. That could be getting a job. That could be just meeting with the vocational specialist. It could be, updating your resume, or finally putting yourself out there and going on some interviews. It could be transitioning from a transitional work position to a competitive work position. Could be very specific, could be a goal to get a job in a certain field or a certain career pathway, or it could be just very vague. It could be just, working part-time or working full-time. For some people, the work goal might be getting a job and keeping it. They might have noticed that, they can get jobs and things go okay, but then fairly quickly stuff starts to unravel, and that can be confusing and things kind of go badly quickly. So it could be trying to figure some of that stuff out and not having those patterns repeat in the future. So after they've gone through and taken a couple minutes to write goals for each of these, and then you've open the floor for people to share. And for those who sort of haven't said anything, maybe you would ask if they would like to share. And if they say no, then you kind of move on. But this is a way to sort of start engaging people. We don't want to make them feel uncomfortable, but we also want to involve as many folks in the group as we can in that discussion. So then the next part of this session is our main narrative, which is the work story, which again, as I mentioned earlier, is a life story, but specific to work or employment. And we have some questions here. These are just some questions to get the thought processes flowing. This is not an exhaustive list. There may be other things that aren't here that they want to talk about or answer. And these questions might not make sense to people. And so they can write about something else. They can write about one of these questions or all 9. There's no right or wrong answer here. And I think that's really important. We don't have to feel like everyone has to go through and answer all of these, or even that these are the right questions to be asking. We've noticed that veterans in our previous pilot studies, this is what made sense to them. And these are some of the topics they tended to touch on and write about and talk about when they told their work story. So that's where we got some of these questions. And you can let people know what they write is really for their eyes only. They don't have to share, but we also want people to feel comfortable sharing. And some people will say things like, oh, I'm not good at writing, or I can't spell, or all of that. We tell people like, hey, spelling doesn't count here. We're not going to look at anything you've written. And, none of those things matters. Just do what makes sense to you. We usually give people a solid maybe 10 minutes if you have time to sit and write this, and you kind of notice who's still writing, who needs more time, and then when people are finished. And then you open the floor to see who would like to share their work story. I think most typically in the past, we have a couple people who want to share, and maybe a couple people who just tell little brief snippets of their work story. Oftentimes it was like a previous job that really stands out, maybe one that went well or one that went especially poorly. Sometimes it's the military, and that's perfectly fine too. That's a valid job, and people, that's very important to people's work story in some cases and not in other cases. So I think we're really open here, and we're allowing people to think about themselves, their lives, and start to put together some of those foundational pieces that we'll then use as we go throughout the 12-week intervention. It also, importantly, as facilitators, it helps us get to know them and to form ideas about them in our own minds, and ideas about what might be going well for them regarding their work goals, what might be going poorly, what their patterns are that sort of trip them up, and maybe their patterns are that they can capitalize on and use to sort of further what they want to do. So it just helps us form that case conceptualization in our own mind, because these may be people you don't know anything about, and oftentimes that's the case. And so the work story can be really helpful for us to learn those things. Then lastly, we have one final narrative that I mentioned earlier, which is values and meaning in work. And again, we have prompts. We have 5 questions here. What are your personal values? What matters most to you in life? How do these influence your decision to work and what type of job you might try to find? I mean, what harms your motivation? What helps your motivation? What are some of the benefits and drawbacks of working? Where do you want to go with your career and why? What do you ultimately want to accomplish in life? And is work a part of that? So these are all just very open-ended questions. Again, the purpose of the narrative and these prompts, these questions, is to get people thinking and get people started. It's a jumping off point. They don't have to answer any of these, or they can answer all 5, or they can answer whichever one makes sense. But again, the idea is just to get people thinking about what we mean when we say values and meaning in work and how they might start thinking about it. But they should really write what makes sense to them. Sometimes we're sort of against the clock, group is ending when we get to this, and that's okay if that happens. If you have time to go through it and give people 5 minutes to write, or however many minutes, and then maybe if anyone wants to share, that's fine. But if you're up against the clock, what I've done in the past is that I sort of assign this as the homework, and I emphasize that I'd really like people to do this and that we could touch on it next week. This is also one that sometimes people will write about, but they choose not to share. And I do think this is deeply personal, and it's totally fine if no one wants to share this, or if several people do, that's great too. I think we can be very flexible with that. And, I've seen it go both ways, where some people really keep this close to the vest and they don't want to share this with group, or they slowly share it over time. So if you have time, give people an opportunity to share. You might just ask, does anyone want to share yours? You definitely don't have to, but if anyone has anything they wanted to talk about from theirs, and I usually kind of leave it at that once people have had those opportunities. This is not one where I would typically go to say, hey, John, do you want to share yours? This is one where I sort of just really leave it open-ended. And I encourage as a group, but I don't single anyone out to try to engage them in this way, given the deeply personal meaning of this narrative. So we don't have a take home. Normally we have a take home or a homework assignment at the end of each of our sessions. You can assign this as the homework if you didn't get through it, or just suggest that people kind of take a look. For our virtual groups, it's really important to reinforce how they get into group next week. Their group is at the same day and time with the same link, that we will continue to send it to them before group, but that if they don't have it, they can use the same link they've used the previous week, and then to continue to reinforce that. And we also like to gauge if there's someone who's not going to be able to be at group. We sort of ask that, like, does everyone think they'll be able to come next week? And we really, really, really encourage them to be there as much as they can every week. Even this is very difficult for some people. This material can be challenging to work through. And just the idea of now pursuing work, and this is another pathway to sort of help with that, can be really scary and even threatening for some people, and just a challenge. And so we also are very sensitive to that, but we really encourage people to come. And so at the end of the first session, it's important to do that and to follow up with anyone who had trouble getting on the video and with the technology, and making sure everyone has what they need for the research study, letting us know how we can help, or any veterans with whom we might need to follow up. That would be very helpful for us, because we can help with things like getting people connected with the technology, making sure that if for people who aren't very engaged, maybe didn't talk throughout group, or you couldn't get a read on them, we can always try to help engage them too, especially at the beginning. I think once we get people going and they've come for a few sessions, then it's much smoother for us. And we will also try to not step on your toes as facilitators trying to engage the veterans you're working with. But we try to help as much as we can, so please let us know. All right, so this is my overview for session 1. I'm going to try to do this for each week, and hopefully this will be helpful in addition to what we're doing for sort of our weekly meetings and talking through some of this stuff. These are some of the big things. A very successful first session would be just getting people in the group and sort of a little bit familiar with what we're doing. It's more challenging virtually, I think, in that aspect, although there are definitely some advantages virtually. So the first group, the goal is really just to get people in there and familiar with what we're doing, and then we can take it from there the second session. So try to get through as much of this as you can. Don't worry if you can't get through all of it. That's perfectly fine. Just try to get people in that group and connected and start building that group process. Another thing I didn't mention that's here would be setting those group rules. And those are just the very basic rules that we use for other groups, and just getting people feeling comfortable. That's a huge success for week 1, and just do the best you can with the actual CBTW material as it's laid out in the manual. Deliver what you can and just do the best you can, and we'll go from there. Hope this was helpful, and thanks so much again for being a part of this.